I would like now to move on without any delay to the next session. So the next session is on education, labor market and future of work post-COVID-19. It is shared by my friend and colleague Cinzia Alcidi, who is the Director of Research at the Center for European Policy Studies. Also, the CEPS is one of the founding members of EMNES. So without further ado, Cinzia, the floor is yours to introduce your panel, please.
Many thanks, Rim. Good evening to everyone. It is a pleasure to be able to participate in the EMNES conference. I cannot prevent myself by recalling the conference that we had a bit more than 1 year ago. So in July 2019, we had a big conference, EMNES conference in Brussels with 2 full days, very rich in content and also from the human point of view, because we had more than 200 people coming to the event. So this is something that we definitely miss. But nonetheless, I'm very pleased that we managed to put together the event, and now we have the opportunity to discuss one topic, which is to some extent just related to what I said. We will focus on labor market and the impact of COVID. And of course, the fact that we are having this event online and we are all able to have a discussion, even though we cannot travel and we are all far away, it's to some extent linked to what we will discuss. In fact, the impact of COVID on society and on labor market is clearly large, and digital tools, technological changes is what will be accelerated and will make us able to continue to work despite what COVID is producing. But we have to see actually to what extent people, workers are able to use the instruments which are available, to what extent the infrastructure are in place in order to fully exploit the opportunities that the technology is offering us. So I would like to invite the members, this excellent actually lineup of this panel to share their thoughts. Let me introduce all of them. And I would like to invite all of them to switch on the camera so that we can see. Many thanks. So I will start with Ekkehard. Ernst is the chief of the Macroeconomic Policy and Jobs at ILO. Good evening, Ekkehard. Nathalie Creste, she's advisor at the Directorate-General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusions at the European Commission. Otaviano Canuto is director at Center for Economics, Macroeconomics and Development and senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Floriana Folsi, she is a human capital development expert and country coordinator for Algeria at the European Training Foundation. And then Raja Khalidi is director of Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute. And then last but not least, Hicham Sebti is director at Euromed Business School. Many thanks to everyone to take the time to join us. So I would like to start with Ekkehard, so that the ILO, of course, has done a lot of work when it comes to the impact of COVID on the labor markets. So I would like to invite you to share your thoughts and the findings of your research when it comes to the Mediterranean countries and Africa. Ekkehard. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, and thank you very much to Rim and EMNES for inviting me and for having ILO today at the table for this excellent panel. I'm really looking forward to discuss with my co-panelist this important subject. Let me just share some thoughts based on the research that my colleagues and we have done over the last few months. And I think the first thing that is really, you cannot stress it enough, is really to say that there is no recovery without suppressing the virus. We have to guarantee healthy lives and workplaces if we want to ever kind of expect to return to some kind of normality in our working lives. And I think that's something that is still being questioned by some observers. And I think we really need to stress also in light of the situation that is ongoing now in Europe and in many places of the world, that if we don't find a solution to the health crisis, we cannot expect to go back to some kind of normality. And I think that's something that we should really keep in mind in our approach. The second point I wanted to make is obviously we have to think already about sustaining the economic recovery. Obviously, for a lot of countries, a lot of sectors, activity is still being suppressed. Switzerland just announced today a further reduction and further increase in sectors that have to shut down over the Christmas and vacation period. And I think that obviously that means that activity will not resume anytime soon. At the ILO, we have estimated that in terms of the number of hours worked, we have lost something like 10% with respect to the last quarter in 2019, and so that 10% gap in terms of activity on the labor market needs to be closed, obviously, if you want to recover. But that kind of economic recovery needs to already be sustained now. And I think what's really important that is the demand side is one aspect to it, but we have to prevent that we kind of get a mass scale of business failures that would actually prevent the recovery from taking place. So a lot of the support measures that are needed need to be put in place already now and have been put in place already now to prevent a large scale business failures when we get out of this crisis, to speed up the recovery. And I think one particular element to that is, and which brings me to my third point, is that we will probably see some burst of inflation coming out of this crisis next year, simply because there is such an increase in savings rates that has happened over the last few months and few quarters, that this extra spending will happen the next few months in 2021, and will create some additional inflation, or at least some price hikes in certain sectors. And it will probably mean that, especially for low-income households and low-income countries, they will see some of these consequences in terms of living costs. So the recovery is not only a recovery that might actually be slow, but it will actually be uneven in terms of who is being affected by this and who is benefiting from the recovery, if you want. So the third point is really addressing inequality that we have already seen at entering the crisis, and we will probably see also going out of the crisis. So there's the typical things that are being discussed is that people like us can just move behind the screen, can continue doing their work, whereas a lot of other people, especially in the creative industry and social services, etc., did not have that possibility and basically lost their livelihood. They lost their incomes in developing and low-income countries. Obviously, people actually went into inactivity because simply even in the informal market they could not work anymore. Here in Switzerland, in Geneva, it was really depressing to see how much of the domestic workers were all of a sudden lost their jobs basically from one day to another, and had to queue for in food chains to get at least something to eat. And so this kind of huge spike in inequality and the impact of on inequality across different parts of the labor market is something that needs to be addressed going out. The other obvious example is women have been much more affected by this crisis than men, simply because a lot of care work has still been laid off on women's shoulders rather than on being shared across in the household more equally. And I think again that's something that needs to be addressed going out, whether it's being addressed through, for instance, adjustments in terms of reliefs that need to become through legislation, or whether it putting in some incentives for women and some kind of reward, if you want, to, for instance, in the care industry. That's something that needs to be discussed, but clearly there is an inequality aspect as well. And I think my fourth point is really something more for the medium to long term. We have seen this already during the financial crisis, and it's something that has hit now again, is the younger generation is being particularly hard hit. We know already that those young people that entered the labor market relatively early on and lost their jobs will face long-term consequences in terms of recovering from this crisis. But in addition to that, we also see a lot of young people who have not yet entered the labor market to face challenges going forward, simply because they couldn't follow the same type of education that they would have had if the crisis had never had taken place. So a lot of kids just didn't get the education, and that's months or quarters or even a year lost that will not be these kids will not be able to recuperate. And I think that kind of targeting these young generations, particularly with additional efforts to build up infrastructure and to build up an education system that kind of deliver to these young people the education that they were supposed to have, I think is an important aspect to the policy delivery that we need to put in place in order to avoid long-term scars on the labor market. So I think that's the kind of the four main points that I would like to put forward, and I'm happy to discuss any of these aspects further with my co-panelists later on. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this overarching this overview of the main points related to the impact of COVID. I would like now to move to Nathalie. So the European Commission put forward an impressive response to the COVID crisis in Europe. That's been unprecedented. And just a few days ago, we got the multi-annual financial framework approved. This was really a big thing, which inside as Next Generation EU, which is, as I said, an unprecedented response at European level. Now, of course, we have to see how these resources can be used. Nathalie, can you share your thoughts on this and in general, the impact of COVID on labor markets? Can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you very much for having me invited to your conference, and many thanks also for the very interesting exchanges that we had since yesterday. Reflection about what is still ongoing, a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a societal crisis. And what struck me in those 2 days also has been the place that you've put on measurement and monitoring. As we know that in Mediterranean region, this is one of the main topics that in Cascais ministers have pointed out as a key issue. Taking specifically the case of the Mediterranean region, COVID coupled with the oil price crisis has been disruptive. It has not been alone disruptive as for how labor markets are looking now. In fact, the health crisis has built upon pre-existing weaknesses and vulnerabilities, notably on the labor market. Indeed, the COVID-19 has exacerbated existing trend. It has struck and affected the already most vulnerable categories on the labor market. It has accelerated the trends, revealing weaknesses and limits of existing way of living, of working, and of producing. And in certain cases, it has even inverted trends as it has partially erased the progress that were made in the latest decade. So the question that you raised, that's as the title of your conference, that is what should be done, what are the pillars for recovery? I would say that's the first pillar, a fundamental pillar, is to be found around the notion of building back better. So recovery strategies should not be limited to restoring the ex-ante situation, but to repairing it also, and above all to preparing to future challenges, as we know that there will be. It's life, but also we know that they might happen in future. So preparedness is fundamental. It means building a more resilient society, and this is for me the second pillar. Resilience is a pillar for recovery, meaning that we must be able to cope with and to build upon reality. Resilience at all levels, with currently, of course, as my colleague from ILO said, the priority to solve the health crisis. Certainly, we won't get anywhere if we don't solve it, but this is not the only element, and it should not be to the detriment to all other elements to or dimension for the recovery process, and notably, as we are here for labor markets, the definition of active labor market policies or greener ways to work, produce and live. So building resilience obliges to a holistic approach, solving imperfection and vulnerabilities and inadequacies of systems as a whole. Resilient means integrating all challenges, economic, technological, including digital, social, including the demographic question, the greening of economy, the mobility of workers into a new vision. It means reducing the causes of fragmentation of the Mediterranean region, from security matters to inclusiveness of society, giving education, training, and culture their fair share. It means bringing together the terms of a new social model based on more fairness, more solidarity, more equity, building a more decent world for work. And in this regards, the third pillar for me for recovery comes as a logical condition for success, and it develops around the notion of culture, a culture of dialogue, giving civil society the chance to be heard and to participate to the decision, giving social partners the effective right to be full actors of the definition, of the safeguard, and of the promotion of their rights, and giving private and public partners the frame to work together. This means enshrining these dialogues into a culture that will ensure their sustainability and permanence. Social and solidarity economy, creative and circular economy are models that fit with the Mediterranean regions and with those objectives. They would contribute to knitting together the different elements needed to get to that culture through also the recovery process. They would so contribute to give young women and girls, potentially vulnerable groups, needs, persons with disabilities, refugees, the right they still have not or not always have. It highlights and contributes the need to bridge gap, to transform availability into accessibility, which is not the same, not for all categories at least. Acknowledging and giving education, training, development at best of the skills and talents of people all along life, their fair place, as they are key in that process. Digitalization, globalization of processes, place education questions at the core of the recovery. Creating a sustainable passerelle from the informal economy to the formal economy is also something that we cannot put apart. It's at the center. So, I mean, we have already in the Mediterranean region a certain number of processes and of realities that prove that it can be done and that things are not impossible. So these are the few reflections that come along with what we did at the European level, and that supposes also resources, as it has been mentioned before, to support this action. And we've seen the importance of all the recent decisions at European level, and for instance, the effectiveness of a sure instrument to help guarantee a fair condition on market at the core of the lockdown. So what I would say is that I am a little bit, and this is my conclusion, a little bit worried about speaking of the opportunities of a crisis as COVID is. I think that I would prefer refer to the notion of transformative effect of such a crisis, subject, of course, to real and concrete political will. And political will, under that regard, is really the pillar of those pillars to build a forward, better word and labor market in partnership, which is the key word. Thank you.
Many thanks. Thanks, Nathalie, for sharing your thoughts. Indeed, it's difficult to speak about opportunities, but I think we really need to transform, or to take this crisis as an opportunity, or at least being forced to manage the transformation in the direction which will have some positive effect. I will now would like to move to Otaviano Canuto and ask him to share his thoughts and his view in this.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. And thanks to Rim and all the organizers for having me here. This is really enjoyable. My task will be easy, given the fact that Ekkehard and Nathalie approached several important topics in that regard. First and foremost, I fully agree with Ekkehard when he says that there will be no end of crisis before we have the end of the process of contamination, which necessarily leads us to the global level, in the sense that the race between vaccination and the virus will only be complete once we reach a significant level of immunity at the global stance. So this is not something that can be self-contained in individual countries. Otherwise, while there is any contamination process, regardless of the existence of restrictions to mobility by governments, the people will avoid contacts. And the fact is that this crisis differs from financial crisis or manufacturing-based business cycles, in the sense that it is associated with the downfall of supply and demand of service, contact-intensive service, not technology-intensive service, but definitely in the contact-intensive service. And it's important to keep in mind that there will be, let's say, more temporary effects, but the crisis will leave scars. And so we have to think, we have to observe and try to do something while the crisis is ongoing, while the contamination process is still unfolding, but also to think of the consequence that the crisis will bring. Nathalie was very fortunate when she remarked that, to a large extent, the pandemic is accelerating history, in the sense that some trends that were there are being exacerbated by the pandemic, and that includes the issues of income inequality, because the impacts of the crisis, while it's happening, is particularly hard on gender-wise and also on age-wise, and obviously this has implications, and so we have to take into account, therefore, not only the hardship now, but also the consequence that this will leave, the scars. An important aspect to take into account as well is the issue of informality. We know how the issues with the gig work and other informal kinds of labor occupation were propping up as some issue to be contended with, because these informal jobs, they do not fit into the scope of the traditional welfare states. So some thoughts have to be given to how to adjust, to adapt the system so as to put these people inside the social protection system with a change of design, because the one prevailing before is not appropriate to deal with that kind of new range of work. And if that's true for rich advanced economies, is even more in the case of the developing countries and even emerging markets. We saw during the pandemic the effort by many developing countries and emerging markets to establish some sort of fighting the recession curve measures, trying to establish systems, methods of income transfer so as to save the livelihood of the poor people, of those directly unemployed, and so on. And this was obviously a humongous challenge in the case of countries that do not have a registry of their people, of their labor force, and therefore made difficult the transfer. And this varies in degrees. Take Brazil, my country of origin. 45% of the labor force is in informal activities. Brazil had a registry associated with the basic conditional cash transfers, the family allowance, the Bolsa Familia, but of course wanted to extend the volume of resource transferred through an emergency aid program during the crisis. And it had to suddenly, in a couple of months, to adjust it in order to encompass more people. It ended up covering, including almost a third of the population. But take case of some sub-Saharan African countries where you have degrees of informality that go up to 90% of the labor force. Well, even in the US, where I live today, you had difficulties of mapping out who should receive resource from the treasury, from the government, and that ended up a transfer to all families was implemented, and obviously, definitely a little bit beyond what would be, let's say, more appropriate. So we do have a problem with informality, which will be aggravated by the pandemic, and this dovetails with a previous trend, which is the tendency to have informal and unstable and flexible jobs. And this is an implication regarding the labor market, regarding education as well, because we are watching a rise in the digitalization of processes, which will obviously need a rescaling of a substantial part of the population and so on. So the effects are reasonably mapped out. Let me use the remainder of my time to talk about, let's say, the scars and three implications that I believe will come to the fore in most of the world, including advanced economies. First of all, it's not an issue of back to normal. There's no back to normal. If one thinks of the normal as the picture prior to the coronavirus, prior to the pandemic, but we will have to rebuild back a better world, and that will need three major prongs, I would say. First of all, the need to boost social protection systems has come to the fore, and there will be a push for that. I don't think, for instance, in the case of the US, that the lack of universal access to healthcare will be something that will go back to the fringe. This is going to be first and foremost. And that applies, take the case of the countries that have implemented income transfer programs. one way or another, even if not with the magnitude of what happened this year, but they will not go back to where they were. So boosting social protection system, there will be a generalized call in societies for doing something about it. Second point is on the education that I mentioned, because the shift in jobs and skills will be something in the cards. And with an equal effect, if there is no guarantee, for instance, of even access in the population to internet, to connection. Otherwise, this will be hard for people to do activities, even if we return to schooling with presence of people. It will still be necessary to deal for all students with the digital content of education and so on. So this has come to the fore. And the third is another scar left by the legacy, forgive me, I will say four. But the third is the legacy of the pandemic in terms of higher public debt, while, as I said, we will need boosting social protection systems. So inevitably, a higher degree of taxation will have to take place. In this additional taxation, preferably should go to the upper echelons of the income pyramid rather than the poor. And that includes taxing, let's say, higher incomes, some forms of wealth taxation. And for that to happen, we will have to have cooperation, harmonization among countries. Otherwise, the system gets full of holes and it cannot be implemented. So paradoxically, at times in which globalization has been and multilateralism have been, let's say, attacked, we will need more of that so as to move to an arena where countries individually can do such a taxation. And finally, a point well reminded by Ekkehard, we may be on the verge of a new stage of this pandemic crisis, economic crisis, in the sense that even if we have the, let's say, a gradual elimination of the problem of contamination, there is the legacy in terms of indebtedness of business. And there is the high likelihood that although many companies have have survived through subsidized credit, whenever this ends, particularly if we have some inflation, as Ekkehard pointed out as a possibility, which would lead to some reversal of the monetary policies that have been at play, we might watch in the following months as a series of bankruptcies and so on, is the great reallocation that the Director-General of the BIS has been speaking about, but also my ex-colleagues at the World Bank and my ex-colleagues at IMF have reinforced. So we may be on the verge of a fourth issue to cope with. But the picture is one of rebuilding better the system rather than trying to go back to normal. The old normal is dead. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this actually nice presentation and identification of some key challenges. Among them, you mentioned education and skills, and I think this is actually a nice transition towards the next speaker, Floriana Folsi. I'm sorry, I mispronounced your family name earlier. I shouldn't have, also because we speak the same language originally, sorry. Floriana, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Cinzia. No problem about the last name. Absolutely. Actually, thank you for inviting us, for inviting ETF, the European Training Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here, even if digitally, because it's a difficult time for everyone all around the world. This dialogue today is extremely relevant and is timely. And I have to say that possibly our presentation are very complementary to each other. many of the things that I've tackled, in fact, has been already mentioned by our speakers, so I will actually shorten them and try to get more to the point. Obviously, as we mentioned, the labor market especially, and here I focus in the country where we work, which are also part of this debate, and the Southern Eastern Mediterranean region, they already were affected by challenging also before the eruption of the pandemic in terms of labor market, of course. But obviously this crisis, this health crisis, has intensified the effect and the consequence of it. And if we look at it from a perspective in terms of human capital development, I can only confirm, in fact, what has been said already from our previous speakers, so that specific group will be affected even more than other and will be the one to have the most difficult time. And I'm referring to the youth, the young people that will face increased difficulty in getting their first job or in finding new ones. And youth represent in this specific region a large share of the population. If we think that we have between 22 and 34% of people aged between 15 and 29 years old. We recently actually ran a research exactly on the situation of youth in the region that will be published at the beginning of next year, that has investigated the situation of young people who are needs, which has been mentioned before. Those are the ones not in employment, education, and training, but also the situation of those that are in employment, what type of job they have, what security level, how the job match their skills and qualification. And the study have been running also more in deep into the reality of countries such as Jordan and Egypt that I had the pleasure to heard about also in the previous panel. I wanted to start with some positive hints, but it is true that during such a pandemic, obviously what has been gained and earned in the past 10 years in terms of positive trend is obviously at risk. For instance, in our study, we noticed in Egypt, which was one of the case studies, that although the gender gap is still an issue through the whole Southern Eastern Mediterranean region, we noticed already in Egypt the sign of improvement, quite a good, strong sign about it, because the percentage of women in higher education increased by 10% point, and the share of homemakers dropped by 15% point, further confirming significant changes related to gender. And this is also confirmed by the decreasing of gender gap in the need indicators. And in spite of a fairly stable youth need rates over time, we observe a significant reduction of the need gender gap, which passed from 52.4 percentage point to 28.5. At the same time, education plays obviously an important role, and this is something that has been already confirmed. Everybody agrees on that. And it is true that higher education also has an impact in terms of employer rate. We noticed through this research that in the case of Egypt, also a person with tertiary education has a highest chance of being employed of almost 13 times, comparing with someone with a general secondary education. A moment ago, Otaviano was saying it is mainly about reskilling rather than upskilling. It is about providing to people the right skill in order not only to get a job, but also to keep themselves into the employment market. An extraordinary measure will be needed to face a extraordinarily complex situation. However, as a real game changer, that's how we can call it, in fact, this pandemic, it can also offer some opportunity. I still want to stay positive and mention them as opportunity to accelerate this transformation towards new development models that are based on socioeconomic and ecological transformation that puts individual at the heart of their policy agenda. Digital and green transitions are reshaping people's life, work and relationship, and this transition has shown us that there is a huge need to shift in skill sets in order to recover full potential, raising new forms of employment, new job platforms, economy, cultural shifts, also new emerging sector, which is finished to heard in the previous panel about banking. Let's talk about digital banking. In fact, there is a lot of changes in there. New technology, Accelerated digitalizations of job, new form of digital learning are opportunities that government need to grasp to provide a new perspective, not only for the young people, but for the entire population, so for everyone, for the active population. And accelerating this transition toward a more digital and green system comes with opportunity, but also, of course, with uncertainties. Building resilience of individual and company and developing agile and coordinated and target public policy is a key to tackle unemployment and to improve the quality of existing jobs. Therefore, in this transition, skills will play a very important role. And I'm talking, as already before, even in the third panel, when the topic was social protection, we're talking about lifelong learning skills. And those are skills that goes through the entire process of life and that allow to transit to new job as well. So investing in training programs that keep people with the skills needed for the new job and for the clean, low carbon economy will be essential. And it's something that we should keep in mind. And the floor is back to you, Cinzia. Thank you.
Many thanks, Floriana, not least for keeping the positive aspect in your presentation. I'm now moving straight to Raja Khalidi. Please, your thoughts on the issue of the impact of COVID on the labor markets.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this very interesting panel. And in fact, the whole afternoon has been, for me, confirmed many of the pertinence of many of the issues that have become the forefront of our work at MAS. And in fact, I think even at the national level, if you wish, the social and economic policy agenda. You know, we can talk about labor markets in some detail, but I think here what I could be most useful at is providing you with a broad brush assessment of the shocks that we went through this year, the post-pandemic challenges, and some of the opportunities maybe with some focus, but not exclusively on labor and social issues. To begin with, 2020, of course, for all of us, was a shocking year, economically and socially. But in Palestine, this was, let's say, a triple shock, maybe, coming on top of a structurally deformed economy, owing to prolonged occupation, which features already increasing inequality. And given the political environment that we've lived in last years, especially, sort of an existential threat to the very concept of a Palestinian national economy. This has been something that this year, under this idea of annexation, we're talking about a lot. So we've had a sort of a triple P, if you wish, shock, PPP, pandemic, public finances, and political threats. The pandemic, of course, we and others, the bank and the Palestinian Bureau of Statistics, estimated a hit to GDP and GNI of between 11 and 21%, depending which indicator and which source. We experienced another year of a public finance deficit crisis, but a public finance crisis with a deficit at the end of the year, despite the resolution of that crisis recently, with a deficit close to $1 billion, around 25% of the budget, and a squeeze on government spending, which has been just about able to keep up with the public health response needs, emergency ones. Again, we have a public health system which needs more work. And finally, political threats, of course, from the volatility and the hostility of 2017 to 2020, compared with what we hopefully will be a less harsh environment in the coming few years at least. So as for the post-pandemic challenges now, let's say at the end of the year, we've done, we did a number of field and analytical and policy and other research over the year especially on COVID impacts, socials, economic, governance, etc. So, I mean, first, take on that, if I may say so. In addition to the monitoring we do, of quarterly produce an economic monitor which looks at all of the macro and other institutional sectors of the economy. But the post-pandemic challenges, maybe let's start with the K recession, which I don't know, maybe came up in different parts of today's discussion or yesterday's, but in our case, is probably so far looks to be what we're going to be facing. So you've had these extraordinary macroeconomic shocks, not only affecting consumption and investment, including public sector investment, but also shocks on the dependency channels on externally determined sources of national income, primarily those controlled by Israel. We have a weak domestic productive capacity and continued high levels of, again, these, if you wish, colonial economic dependency channels, trade, through labor, and through seigniorage, monetary seigniorage. So this is, of course, like elsewhere, fissures have been revealed in the social fabric and the clear absence of a Palestinian social protection system. We've, highlighted the extent to which informal and small producers have an extreme vulnerability compared to the salaried private sector and public sector employees. And here I would be talking in that informal sector of up to 40% of the labor force, of the employed labor force. And of course, we've had now discouraged a whole new wave of discouraged youth and female employment potential. So we have shortfalls as elsewhere in the region, but in the context, let's not forget, of a very distorted and segmented labor market. So you have the West Bank, you have Jerusalem, you have Gaza, you have those working in Israel, and these are all sort of separately, if you wish. We have labor markets, unfortunately. We don't have a labor market. Governance, and then there's clear governance failings at the central level. And I would go as far as saying a disconnect between central and local management of the crisis, of fighting the pandemic, of fighting occupation, of development, of doing development. And this is all, we know, linked to a political representation and government accountability deficit, to put it mildly. Now, that being said, so, we're going to see a continued section of the population not recovering. And then, we've already seen certain segments, like as elsewhere in the service economy and other areas, somewhat compensating for our own losses in our own heavily dependent service economy. Now, the greatest opportunities in 2021 going forward, I suppose I would conceive it as, building up our sort of economic weight in the asymmetric balance of power that we face. Both, I'm not talking about political asymmetric balance, but I'm talking about the economic one, the unlevel playing field, if you wish, whereby we, by virtue of our links to through Israel trade regime to the international trading regime, we are paying, as they say, all of the costs of WTO membership, and we have not enjoyed one of the benefits, supposedly. So, I mean, that sort of asymmetry applies across the board to the manner in which, Israel can withhold our fiscal revenues, trade revenues for political reasons, etc. So the first, I think, greatest potential that we must, and NASA is working and will continue working on, is to help begin the long march, so to speak, to universal social protection. This will entail, and this is doable, and ILO, who are active here, and others know that we can have a lot more work done on active labor market policies, especially minimum wage, and of course the very dismal state of workers' labor union mobilization. These are issues which must be dealt with because we have a situation where there's not a state, so there's nobody really to appeal to. There's not a political system that is elected, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to reinforce these informal social capital, if you wish, components in our system. Again, in addition, we need to push for a gradual and careful, however, move towards a greater formalization of the economy with the trade-off entailed of better social security. So, you cannot expect the small producers to formalize if you're not going to give them some protections and guarantees going forward in return as a social contract, let's say. Obviously, we're looking for increased public investment in domestic economic infrastructure and productive capacity, and this is something which the P&A has recently come around to after many years of not thinking enough about that. And less dependency, hence, on channels of colonial control, both in terms of trade with and through Israel, as well as labor, the part of our labor force which is employed in Israel, under very deleterious conditions, which are totally in violation of ILO, global labor standards. Obviously, we want to continue, but in fact intensify the continuous efforts which have been going on, but need now to be accelerated to better match educational system outputs to both market demand and to strategic innovation and productive capacity building for greater self-reliance, as well as for greater benefit from the potential of regional trade and investment integration arrangements. And here I'm referring to not only Europe, but also Israel, but also our Arab trading partners. Two other, if I may, maybe political points, but they are very important to our development ability to envision and to implement a development strategy, if you wish, is the issue of the governance of the state of Palestine under occupation, whereby we try to refocus governance to a greater role for the local and the regional economic and development and planning, as well as administration, which we saw during the pandemic were effective, and maybe as effective as central government. And I think we have, let's finalize, just conclude by saying, I think we have a favorable international environment, at least that we have not faced for the last 4 years, to achieve some gains, not political, but some gains, translate into diplomatic terms the fact that Palestine deserves to have an international financial status, so that it can resort in future emergency to funding from the IMF and to formal lending by various international as well as Arab lenders in a way that could have allowed it to intervene much more effectively in combating the adverse effects of the recessions of last year. So thank you very much. I mean, that's, I think, all I can say for this moment, and I think it echoes with much of what I heard this afternoon as well.
Many thanks. I think what you said actually in general reminds us that the pandemic in many cases is adding to existing vulnerabilities and other kind of shocks. So this is certainly cannot be avoided. I see already Excellencies El Said. So I would like to close with the last intervention by Hicham Sebti, and then we close the session. Hicham, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cinzia, and thank you, Rim, for the opportunity to hear the colleagues. And I will try to be very brief, just to share with you some early results we are having from a study we are carrying about work in Morocco during the pandemic crisis. In my research, I use some sociological framework to try to analyze work as it is really done on the ground and try to understand work as a practice. So we found that the move many organizations had to do during the first lockdown was very interesting to analyze how work is moving, and it was a kind of crash test to try to understand and learn for the future of work that is described as more digitalized, more agile, flexible, horizontal, remoted, etc. So what we done, we did a series of interviews and observation in different fields of activities. So what we observed is that the way people feel about their work during the pandemic was not really related to the kind of job they are doing or the kind of activity they are working on, or the kind of, if their job is prestigious or not. It was much more related to how space and how bodies were influence their work and the way the work is done. More precisely, we defined it and identified 3 groups of workers that share some features. The first group is what we called virtual workers. This group, we can find in this group higher intellectual professions, managers, consultants, professors. Maybe most of us will be in that group. This group had to face, for some of us, for the first time, a kind of virtual working scene, and they had to see the impact of this virtual working scene on their interaction routines and the way they do their job and the way they socialize in their jobs and during their meetings. So this was the first idea. We had to move and to define new kind of sociability to work and to have meetings. The second point for also that same group is that we discovered the impact of the virtual work in terms of cognitive demand. And we all discovered that new concept of Zoom fatigue that we all need to live with right now. So this was very difficult for some people. And in addition, we had that impact on the connectivity and the availability. There was a higher expectation of connectivity and availability, and people were asking people to be always connected and always available to respond to some working demands. So this was the first group. The second group is what we call the localized body workers. These people need to work in a specific area. They cannot do their job from their home. We can find here both prestigious professions such as doctors, pharmacists, but also underprivileged profession such as nurses, cashier, factory worker, and so on. So for that people, the difficulty was to live every day in their working space with the virus and the fear to be to get the virus and the fear of contagion. And they had to build some new ways to do their work and some new ways to manage the risk during the pandemic period. And they still have to do that. The third group is what we called the mobility workers. In that group, we can find people like street vendors, drivers, delivery men, planners. And for that people, the difficulty was that they had to move from different spaces and different places, some that were that we call dirty places and other healthy places. So they need to reshape their space and the space where they do their job. And this was very difficult for most of them. So in our perspective, this raises some issues that we need to tackle as researchers and also as academics, universities or schools. The first issue is the relative value of workers. We all discovered the importance of economic care workers, such as people who work for food, education, health, mobility. Those people are usually undervaluated socially, and we are asking for the revision of the recognition scale. We need to recognize much more this kind of people. The second issue, I think, is the gender inequality. Most of the colleagues talked about that. The third one is the search for a meaning in the work. Many professions felt very useless during the pandemic, and they are looking for works who are much more concrete, want to do something that is useful for the society. And the fourth issue is the fact that we cannot isolate the analysis of work from the analysis of the society, the mobility, and the city. So we need to have something which is more global to understand the future of work from the perspective of the pandemic crisis. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hicham, and many thanks to all of you. The time is up, so we will not have time for further discussion. Let me just try to summarize very quickly a few main points which came out from this discussion. The first one is that, I mean, of course, the pandemic is still on. So the shock is still on and it's not finished. So, of course, in order to go back to some sort of normality, sorry, I shouldn't have said going back to normality, but to find some normality in our lives, we need to solve the health crisis. The second point is that there is, we are in a point of no return, I would say. So the point was made by several speakers. The shock is so dramatic that there is no possibility of going back. And in building basically the new recovery, we should keep in mind what were the fragilities of the past and trying to move towards a recovery which implies a society and economy which are more resilient. The third point, which I think came back also several times, is that the societies in which and economies in which the informal sector is important are those who will face bigger challenges. And the experience actually should be used as a lessons that social security and better social protection is a key pillar of building a more resilient economy and society. And the last point is that given the transformation that this pandemic is imposing and accelerating, having the right skills will be key for workers, not only to get up new jobs, but also to maintain the current jobs. So reskilling will be an issue. I think all of us are actually faced with all these issues and all the vulnerable groups and those who have less opportunity to access trainings and education will be more in difficulty. So this becomes very important. Last but not least, the gender dimension. I think it is very important, was highlighted by several speakers that this crisis has hit particularly women for different reasons, both in advanced economies and those who are still lagging more behind. And this is a priority that should be kept in mind. I will close it here. Many thanks to all of you for sharing your thoughts and very insightful contribution. And now back to Rim. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. That was really very interesting discussion on this topic, and I'm sure that we will continue discussing it in the next months. I think this is really a preliminary, I would say, sharing of thoughts on the future of work, labor market, and education. I think these are aspects which at EMNES will be continuing to work on and trying really to disentangle all these implications that we've seen now. Of course, there is another major, I would say, impact, which I've been reading upon over the last months, is the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health. And I think this will certainly have